This podcast is on the urinary system. Now, the urinary system consists of all the components and organs and structures which produce, transport and store urine. So when we're talking about the urinary system, we're talking about the kidneys, the left and the right kidney, and the tubes that take the urine from the kidneys down to the bladder. These are the ureters. So there are the left and the right ureters. And the ureters drain into the base of the urinary bladder. Now there's only two bladders in the human body. There's the gallbladder and there's the urinary bladder. And when people say bladder, what they normally mean is the urinary bladder. But it is good to be precise. So we're talking about the urinary bladder. And then the exit, where the urine passes from the urinary bladder out to the outside world, is the urethra. So this is the urinary system. Now when we're talking about kidneys in particular, we're talking about the renal system. So renal is to do specifically with the kidneys. Now the main function of the kidneys is to filter and purify blood, taking blood out of the arterial system, taking out impurities in that blood, taking out toxins in that blood, and taking out things that we might have too much of. So for example, if you drink too much water, it will take some of that water out. And instead of returning to the venous system, those impurities and things that the body wants to get rid of will be transported into the urine. So the kidney is all the time filtering large volumes of blood, taking out impurities, homeostatically regulating that blood and putting anything it doesn't want into the urine. So the kidneys are constantly forming urine. And when the urine is formed, it goes into the ureters. Now the ureters are muscular tubes and they have peristaltic walls. So the urine is peristaltically propelled down the ureters by waves of contraction. And those waves of contraction force the urine into the bladder, and the bladder will fill up and stretch. And then from time to time, when the bladder has stretched a particular amount as it fills up with urine, it will be emptied, and it will be emptied through the urethra. And this is very important because this gives us a one-way flow of urine through the urinary system. And this is important because some bacteria can get into the bladder, and we don't want them to ascend in the ureters to get up to the kidneys, because if you get infection in your kidneys, that can be really quite serious. That's a condition called pyelonephritis, and your patient will be very ill and need antibiotics. So to prevent that, we want to flush the bacteria with the flow of urine. So there should be no reflux in the flow. It shouldn't go backwards. In physiology, it always goes from the kidneys to the ureters to the bladder and out the urethra, flowing in that direction. So let's start off our considerations of the urinary system by thinking about the kidneys particularly. Now, normally more water and ions are ingested than are required by the body. So we tend to eat a lot of potassium in fruit, for example, and vegetables, and tea and coffee. And we can eat quite a lot of salt because that's in sodium chloride. And we get a lot of sodium and chloride ions in the blood. And also we can drink more water than we need. So if we take more of these things than we need, the excess amounts need to be excreted. Otherwise the amount of potassium in the blood would build up. The amount of sodium in the blood would build up. The amount of water in the blood would build up. And of course, these are all abnormal situations. We need to maintain the homeostasis of the blood and the tissue fluids. For example, if we had too much water in the circulation, that would be a condition called fluid overload. What would happen then is the fluid would seep into the patient's lungs. The patient would develop pulmonary edema and be unable to breathe properly and may even die from that condition. Or If too much sodium was allowed to accumulate in the blood, that would be a pathological condition called hypernatremia. Too much sodium. Remember, sodium is Na, so hypernatremia would be too much sodium. Again, a pathological condition. It would alter the electrolyte composition of all the body fluids. Or if the potassium was allowed to build up, that would be a condition called hyperkalemia. And actually that can be fatal really quite quickly, because that will interfere with the way that the myocardial cells polarize and depolarize, meaning that the patient can go into cardiac arrest if the amount of potassium is not regulated. So we don't want fluid overload, we don't want hypernatremia, we don't want hyperkalemia. So all of these things need to be homeostatically regulated by good renal function. And the way that water and ions are eliminated from the body is to incorporate them into the urine, which is then simply voided and is no longer the body's problem. And this means that the kidneys are responsible for regulating these volumes, as well as the composition of body fluids. So they're regulating the amount of body fluid, and they're regulating what that body fluid composes of in terms of what is dissolved in that body fluids. And as well as this, the kidney excretes waste products from metabolic activities. So all the time there's metabolic biochemical processes being carried out by all of the living cells in the body. And as a result of this metabolic biochemical activity, there's going to be some waste products which are going to be inevitably produced. And if these are allowed to accumulate in the body fluids, they will reach toxic levels and the body cells will be poisoned. And the kidneys are able to isolate and concentrate these waste products in the urine, which again is voided from the body, so it's no longer the body's problem, meaning that these waste products of the metabolic activity of the body are no longer acting as toxins in the body, they are eliminated. So the kidneys are excreting toxins and homeostatically regulating things that should be there, like water, potassium and sodium. Now there are two kidneys in the body. They're located high in the abdominal cavity and they're at the back on the posterior abdominal wall. And they're not actually part of the peritoneal cavity. So in the abdominal section of the body, there's a peritoneal cavity which is surrounded by peritoneal membrane. And this contains things like the gastrointestinal tract, or most of the gastrointestinal tract. But the kidneys are behind this. So the kidneys are described as being retroperitoneal. So they're in the abdominal part of the body, but they're not in the peritoneal sac. They are retroperitoneal structures. And they're darkish red and they are bean-shaped. They're shaped like kidney beans. Or to put it another way, kidney beans are shaped like kidneys. And the right kidney is a little lower than the left. And this is due to the presence of the liver above the right kidney, which is a fairly large, bulky organ. Now, because of the domed nature of the diaphragm and the way that the ribs curve around, the upper part of the kidneys do receive some protection from the lower ribs. And as well as this, because the kidneys are relatively delicate organs, they're embedded in a layer of fat called perirenal or perinephric fat. Peri means round about, so perirenal fat is the fat around about the kidneys. And neph is another prefix which relates to kidneys as well. So nephric is to do with the kidneys. So again, perinephric fat means around about the kidneys. So in this context, the term perirenal and perinephric actually just means exactly the same thing. And in fact, the fatty layer round about the kidneys is itself surrounded by a renal fascia, a layer of tough fibrous tissue, which is holding the kidneys into the adjacent tissues so they don't move around. And also provides some additional protection for the kidneys themselves. Now, immediately surrounding the surface of each kidney is a layer of collagen-rich fibrous tissue, which is the renal capsule. This is only 2 or 3 millimeters thick, but it's tough tissue with lots of proteinaceous fibres in it. And I'm sure you may well have noticed that if someone pokes you in the kidneys in your back, it's very painful. And the reason it's so painful is because this renal capsule contains a lot of pain receptors. It contains a lot of nociceptors, so it's very sensitive. So kidney trauma is very painful, or if there's a swelling inside the kidney that stretches this capsule, that's also a very painful condition because it is rich in specific pain receptors. It is rich in the nociceptors. The outer layer of the kidney itself, just under the renal capsule, is the renal cortex. So the cortex is the outside of an organ. So the outside layer of the kidney is the renal cortex. And under the cortex there's another layer called the medulla. And the medulla is the inside layer of an organ. And because this is the medulla of the kidney, of course it's the renal medulla. So we have the renal capsule, under that we have the renal cortex, and under that we have the renal medulla. And the renal medulla is actually composed of structures called renal pyramids. Now most people will have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 individual renal pyramids, something like that. Some people might have even more. Apparently the most frequent number of renal pyramids in humans is 8. And between these renal pyramids, which are triangular shaped structures, there are projections down from the cortex referred to as the renal columns. And the inner area of the kidney is called the renal pelvis. And the renal pelvis is where the urine drains once it's been formed. And the renal pelvis is continuous with the ureter, taking the urine from the kidney to the renal pelvis into the ureters, ready to be peristaltically transported down towards the bladder. Now once the urine's been produced, it comes out of the points or the apex of the medullary pyramids, and it drains into a structure called a calyx, initially into a structure called a minor calyx. So there are many of these, and collectively they're called calyces. And these are essentially outward projections of the renal pelvis. They collect the urine directly from the renal pyramids, from the medullary pyramids, and it drains into a minor calyx. And then several minor calyces will come together to form a major calyx, and the major calyx will transport the urine directly into the renal pelvis. Now at the centre of the concave side of each kidney there's a region called the renal hilum, and the hilum is the gateway or the doorway into the kidney, and it's a relatively small area where the blood vessels go in and out of the kidney, the nerves and lymphatic vessels go in and out of the kidney, and it's also the doorway through which the ureter travels to transport the urine out of the kidney. Now this is a little hard to imagine, but the hilum is indented in the way, so the kidneys are essentially hollow, and the renal pelvis and the large blood vessels are actually located in a hollow inside the overall structure of the kidney, and this is called the renal sinus, and this is filled with fat to add additional protection. So the kidney kind of folds round on itself, leaving this gap in the middle called the renal sinus. And through the renal sinus, as we've said, the blood vessels pass to and fro, the lymphatics pass to and fro, the nerves pass to and from the kidney, and it also contains the renal pelvis. And also, while we're talking about the overall anatomy of the area, on top of each kidney, looking for all the world like a little hat sitting on top of the kidney, on top of each one there is a suprarenal gland. And we now know that these suprarenal glands, the glands above the kidney, are in fact the adrenal glands. The tissue is not continuous with the kidney, they're actually separated by a membrane, but the adrenal glands sit just on top of each kidney. And you might remember that the adrenal gland is also an organ with a cortex and a medulla, which has endocrine functions. So that's a brief introduction to the overall structures in the urinary system and the main components of the kidney.